Good evening. Welcome to the American Public University Senior Seminar. My name is Chastity Holloman, and today I will be discussing my critical review of the book Silent Spring. Rachel Louise Carson was born in Springdale, Pennsylvania on May 27, 1907. She was primarily raised by her mother, who instilled in her a love for nature at a young age. As a child, Carson spent most of her time exploring and writing stories about the world around her. In 1925, she attended the Pennsylvania College for Women, where she originally majored in English, but later changed her major to biology. At that time, women were not deemed intellectually or physically fit to practice science. In 1932, she received a master's degree in zoology from Johns Hopkins University and studied marine biology at the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. After college, she began her career as a part-time scriptwriter for the Bureau of Fisheries, now known as the Fish and Wildlife Service. She later became editor-in-chief and served as an aquatic biologist. Carson was only the second woman to work for the Bureau of Fisheries in a non-secretarial role. Years later, Carson left the Bureau to focus on writing. Her first book, Under the Sea Wind, was published in 1942 and was followed by two other marine-focused publications as well as numerous scientific articles. She experienced great success as a writer, winning several awards and gaining the public's respect as a reputable voice for science. While working on her most notable literary work, Silent Spring, Carson was diagnosed with breast cancer. She died just shortly after the book was published, never getting to fully witness the long-lasting, profound impact her work would have on environmentalism in the U.S. Although she had long been concerned with the interactions between humans and nature, in 1958 Carson received a disturbing letter from her friend named Olga Huckins. In the letter, Huckins gave a personal account of the devastation to multiple life forms in her town resulting from toxic pesticide use. The contents of this letter are what inspired Carson to write Silent Spring. Silent Spring was published on September 27, 1962. However, portions of the book first appeared in The New Yorker a few months prior to its full release. Controversy immediately ensued. At the time of its publication, tensions were high as America and its allies were in the midst of war with the Soviet Union. The field of chemistry, which gained tremendous recognitions in the years following World War II, was a governing science at the time and was highly regarded for its contributions to agriculture through the creation of numerous synthetic chemical pesticides, most notably DDT. Science was still very much dominated by males, many of which publicly scrutinized Carson's credibility as a reliable source of scientific information. In a nation preoccupied by war and the pursuit of prosperity, concern for the environment was not yet a significant matter of political importance. That would soon change as Carson's message gained recognition and the public mindset began to shift. Silent Spring was not simply a declaration of the dangers of pesticides, but rather an ecological narrative of the range of consequences that occur when man attempts to dominate nature. Carson's frustration with man's arrogant belief that nature exists purely for his benefit is very apparent throughout the text. She argues that man's preference for monoculture, rather than the balanced variability of species modeled by nature, is what fueled farmers' pest problems, creating a market for chemical-based solutions. She frequently criticizes the government's approval of indiscriminate pesticide use without fully assessing and disclosing the risks. She offers a variety of case studies which illustrate the many repercussions of the reckless application of chemicals prompted by misinformation from industry leaders. As the book draws to an end, Carson offers an alternative to the chemical assault on pests. She suggests the use of biotic controls, such as utilizing a pest's natural enemies, and encourages the reader to be considerate of less harmful solutions that would not upset the balance of nature. I would now like to highlight and assess some key aspects of the book in greater detail, as well as discuss the ways in which this book influenced the field of environmental science. The first key point I would like to address concerns the qualifications and credibility of the author. Rachel Carson was a pioneer of environmentalism in the U.S. Her academic background, scientific experience, and extensive knowledge of ecotoxicology enhanced the credibility of claims made in Silent Spring. There is no question that Rachel Carson was a very well-educated woman. She was knowledgeable of a number of sciences including marine biology, zoology, genetics, toxicology, and ecology. She spent the vast majority of her life studying the natural world and its many forms. She was passionate about understanding the ways in which species, especially humans, interact with their environment and the impacts which result from these interactions. Her career with the Bureau of Fisheries provided her with years of relevant research and field experience, which she was able to successfully apply to her work on Silent Spring. Carson's interest in the indiscriminate use of pesticides began long before the book was published. In 1945, she had written an article on this topic for Reader's Digest. However, the magazine refused to publish it. Unfortunately, after the release of Silent Spring, Carson's credibility was ferociously attacked by the USDA, chemical manufacturers, and the media. In July of 1962, shortly after excerpts of Silent Spring were published in the New Yorker, the president of the Montrose Chemical Corporation stated that Carson was not a scientist, but a fanatic defender of the cult of the balance of nature. The Manufacturing Chemists Association called her work a disappointment. However, several industry leaders admitted they could find little error of fact in her work, and even the USDA openly admitted that pesticides could be harmful if not used properly. The bias of Carson's critics is evident, and despite the skepticism concerning her credentials as a reputable female scientist, Carson stood by her claims and continued to speak out against haphazard pesticide use. The next thing I would like to point out is the significant role the book's delivery played in its reception. Carson's combination of writing styles and use of expressive language enhanced the effectiveness of Silent Spring. She successfully produced feelings of empathy and discontent in regards to the plight of nature inflicted by human activity. Right from the beginning, Carson's words aimed to appeal to the reader's emotions with a graphic account of a fictional American town where life has essentially been silenced by chemical pesticide poisoning. Carson writes, "There was once a town in the heart of America, where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. Then a strange blight crept over the area. Everywhere was a shadow of death. No enemy action had silenced the rebirth of new life in this stricken world. The people had done it to themselves." Throughout the book, she continues to engage the reader by posing numerous thought-provoking questions. For example, in Chapter 3, entitled Elixirs of Death, Carson asks, "We are rightly appalled by the genetic effects of radiation. How, then, can we be indifferent to the same effect in chemicals that we disseminate widely in our environments?" This particular quote also ties in with the next point on my list. Several times throughout the book, Carson compares man's chemical attack on insects and nature to acts of war. As I mentioned previously, Silent Spring was written at the height of the Cold War. The public's fear of nuclear fallout and deadly radiation was strong in America. Carson played off the current events at that time by comparing her message to a topic that was largely familiar in order to demonstrate how each should elicit a similar concerned response. Carson also makes frequent use of metaphors to explain the impact of chemical pesticides. For example, she writes, "Like the constant dripping of water that in turn wears away the hardest stone, this birth-to-death contact with dangerous chemicals may in the end prove disastrous." Here she is explaining how a lifelong exposure to toxic chemicals could eventually result in severe health issues, even if these consequences are not immediately apparent. One other thing I would like to point out about Carson's writing is her awareness of who her primary audience would be. Given her questionable status among the realm of male scientists, Carson aimed her message toward the more common folk, such as the housewives and civilians who were on the front lines witnessing the destruction she spoke of. She carefully balanced the use of descriptive and provocative language with clearly explained scientific concepts. After Silent Spring was published, Carson received a bad rep for being overly emotional and not scientific enough, but this was her intention all along. The ways in which she wrote were specifically tailored to her audience, which enabled her to elicit the intended reaction. Lastly, I would like to address the scope of the book's impact on public attitudes and political actions. Silent Spring is credited with inciting a modern environmental movement in the U.S. It transformed the public's perceptions on the ways in which humans and nature interact. Carson's work ultimately led to policy reforms that would shape the future of environmental law. Silent Spring is credited with many amazing accomplishments. It is largely believed to have initiated the modern environmental movement in the U.S., which began shortly after its publication. Carson's words transformed the way people viewed and understood the interactions between man and nature. Chemicals that were once believed to be safe were now scrutinized by an outraged public which demanded answers from its government. People began to recognize the value of nature's ability to sustain life, and on April 22, 1970, millions of Americans gathered across the nation to celebrate the very first Earth Day. As a result, policy began to shift in favor of environmentalism, leading to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, a ban on DDT, and a number of new laws to address air and water quality and the protection of wildlife. Carson's effectual combination of expressive language, scientific expertise, and personal experiences produced a profound literary work that revolutionized public attitudes, established a nation of environmentalism, and shaped the future of environmental policy in the U.S. Silent Spring is just as relevant today as it was decades ago. Although Carson's work significantly reformed opinion and policy, America is currently in the midst of an environmental slump. New chemicals are currently being produced at an alarming rate, many of which enter the market prior to proper analysis of potential risk. The destruction of species and natural systems at the hands of man is rampant. Today's environmental scientists and activists must face and overcome the same obstacles that Carson did all those years ago. Silent Spring remains a valuable learning tool for those who stand with nature and spend their lives working to defend it.